I spent decades restoring a family estate, but the day my husband tried to evict me from the home I rebuilt, everything changed. My name is Vivian Hart, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to. The estate had been a ruin the first time I saw it. Broken windows, vines threading through the porches, a roof that leaked like a sieve. My husband, Mark, talked about family legacy the way other people talk about weather. He remembered summer picnics, his father's laugh, the stonework on the east wall. I heard the nostalgia, and I heard an unspoken request. I had a small inheritance from my mother after she died. It wasn't huge, but it was steady money that felt like a gift with an obligation. Keep something of our family alive. So I spent it on the estate. At first it was weekends, then it became weekdays. I learned to read roofing contracts and antique window makers, to bargain with masons and preserve original beams. I cataloged every penny in a spiral notebook hidden in a drawer, a ledger of paint, furnace parts, a replacement staircase. I put off new shoes, doctor appointments, and trips to see my sister because the chimney had to be repaired. The guest wing needed insulation. The garden beds required soil that didn't taste of ash. Mark would walk through, hands in his pockets, and say things like, "You always make it nicer," as if the work belonged to air. Months turned into years. Friends envied the photos I posted, the dining room with its restored plaster medallion, the greenhouse that became the neighborhood's winter refuge. But the compliments always landed on me alone. When neighbors asked who was behind the restoration, Mark would smile and say, "We did." When contractors wanted payment, he told them I handled the accounts. When the tax assessor came by and accidentally wrote the address in his notes as Hart Family Estate, Mark would pat my hand and say, "Everything's fine. You handle those papers. You're good with numbers." I acquiesced because it felt right to be useful, to be the one who could keep things running. The small cruelties matured into pattern. He stopped asking about my day. He assumed I'd be available to host birthdays, plan her mother-in-law's 75th, be the person who sat with the gardener while he had chemo. He would make decisions about paint colors or new fixtures and then text me like, "Cool," as if I were his assistant. Once at a luncheon where he'd introduced me to an old college friend, he said, "Vivian is the reason this place still stands," in a tone meant to be flattering, and then corrected himself with a chuckle. "Well, she keeps the contractor bills straight. I do the heavy lifting." I smiled. I always smiled. It was easier than explaining the ledger, the invoices, the late nights balancing contractors' schedules. And then there was the tax scare. The county issued a flyer about back taxes on historic properties that could trigger massive penalties if the ownership wasn't structured correctly. Mark came home pale. He paced the kitchen at midnight and asked me to take a look. He said the county might lien the property unless we changed how it was titled. He asked me to go into the study, to sign a temporary transfer, something that would, in his words, protect the estate from bureaucratic fines. He handed me a stack of papers. I read them. He read them. He told me it would be simple, done only to buy time until the assessment was sorted. He kissed my cheek and said, "You're better with this." I signed. He signed. We both signed. For a long time, that signature was nothing but ink on paper, a small footnote in the story of our lives. I never imagined there would come a night when that same ink would mean the difference between keeping the only home I had fought for and being told to pack a bag and leave. One afternoon, a twist arrived that felt like a pinprick in a balloon. I was reorganizing the study, file folders and blueprints, piles of paint swatches, when my fingers brushed a box in the back of the desk. It was labeled in my handwriting, "Historic, do not discard." Inside, hidden beneath brittle newspaper clippings and a photograph of Mark's grandfather, was the original deed, inked and stamped, with both our signatures and an annotation that transferred title in the event of a tax lien. I held it, breath shallow. In the margin, someone had written, "Signed to protect estate." The paper was both proof and promise, and for a moment the decades of labor and small indignities that had felt endless suddenly had a shape. Before I could tuck it away, the phone rang. It was Mark's sister, voice sharp. "Have you heard? Mark filed for divorce." The ledger slipped from my lap. Her words, thin, casual, final, hit harder than the discovery. That night I slept with the deed under my pillow, a tiny, incongruous talisman against the long, familiar ache of being invisible. The divorce papers arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, delivered by a man from the firm Mark had always said was old school. He handed them over and didn't wait to see my face. Somehow he looked embarrassed for the whole room. Mark walked in 20 minutes later with Chloe, her hair a practiced wave, a jacket bought to flatter a 40-something courtroom. They sat as if they were on a set. Chloe's hand found Mark's knee. She smiled like someone who'd rehearsed this moment in a mirror. Mark didn't look at me. He read from a short practice statement. "Vivian, it's time. I want my life with someone else." He wore a bland civility like cologne. At first I thought it was a mistake. I pointed to the deed on the coffee table and he laughed, thin and quick, and said, "Oh, that's a filing thing. You know how these lawyers work." Chloe clapped in a way that sounded designed to punctuate his meaning. "We're starting a new life." I felt small, not because of losing an estate, but because they spoke as if I'd been a tenant in my own marriage. His lawyer slid an eviction notice across the table, a real one. "We'll let you gather your things," the lawyer said, "but the property is going to be reorganized." The phrasing was clinical, like houseplants being moved between rooms. A few days later, the neighbors noticed strange things. The gardener who'd worked on our roses for 30 years was called in for emergency building inspections and then fired with little explanation. Mark began changing the locks on the pool shed and hiring a man to put up discreet, private signs near the drive. Chloe posted pictures of new curtains and a weekend getaway on her feed, tagging Mark with heart emojis that landed like knives. The community whispered. When the Historic Preservation Board called to ask about our plans for the east wall, she said, "We're making it more modern." And when I countered, trying to explain the original blueprint, she waved me off. "We have permits." At a neighborhood luncheon, my neighbor Lila confronted Mark in the back garden. "You can't just kick her out. Vivian literally lived years restoring this house." He smiled without warmth. "Lila, it's not like that. We agreed. We have plans." He sounded like a man reciting a script. He sounded dangerous in his certainty. Chloe leaned in and said to Lila, loud enough for everyone to hear, "No offense, Lila, but some things have to change. This was a little stuck in time. We want things fresh. Fresh like real estate speak for erasing what came before." I tried talking to him alone. I brought up the deed carefully because part of me wanted to be conciliatory, to keep our last threads of decency intact. He looked at it with a half smile and said, "You know that was just paperwork. We'd always planned it differently." His voice carried the old rhetorical dodge he used when debt collectors called, "It'll all be sorted." Then he reached across the table and touched my fingers the way a stranger touches a hand to be polite, brief, non-committal. He told me calmly that Chloe had already moved some furniture in and that their dog would need a corner of the sunroom. "You understand, Viv?" he asked, as if I were an extra arrangement in the room. The small betrayals hardened into cruelty. He started redirecting payments I'd set up, automatic transfers for the estate's maintenance, into accounts I didn't recognize. Contractors told me they were receiving new instructions, often contradicting the schedules we'd set together. Once, in a meeting with the mason who was repairing the stonework, the mason said, "Mr. Hart signed off on a different plan last week," and when I protested, he shrugged, "Business is business." When I tried to call Mark about it that night, his voicemail politely told me he was unavailable. I turned on the porch light and waited on the steps like a woman asking permission to exist. The emotional breaking point came like a small cleaving. Mark sold the blue hydrangeas in the main bed to a boutique florist. He said they didn't fit the new aesthetic. The hydrangeas had been planted the year I convinced the nursery to propagate a rare stock from a dying bush in the backyard. I walked outside one morning and saw men hauling the shrubs away in trucks with a logo for an upscale event planner. Chloe waved from the driveway, sunglasses on, and mouthed, "We needed space." I didn't shout. I didn't slam doors. I simply turned the garden hose on, soaking the empty earth where the roots had been, and felt something in me go cool and final. The deed under my pillow felt heavier than it had before. It had to be time to do the only sane thing left: act. The grief came first. It was a slow animal thing that made me lose my appetite and spend evenings with the curtains drawn. But grief is a patient teacher. As the days passed, the rawness transformed into a precise clarity. I spent a long, wet morning in the study, surrounded by photographs, graduation gowns, a child's crooked bicycle in the rose bushes, the first night the kitchen light worked after the electrician rewired the circuits. I spread the ledger out across the desk and traced the numbers with my finger. Each entry told a story. The furnace repair, the custom shutters, the antiques market where I'd found the dining chairs. The deed lay on top, its edges soft from being handled. I made a list, not a long, dramatic list, just bullets. Cancel automatic transfers, inform contractors, secure personal papers, find new residents, call a lawyer, calm decisions, each one irreversible once carried out. The thing about living with someone for decades is that your life becomes a braid of small financial movements, automatic payments, shared insurance, joint accounts. To separate those threads required method and patience, not drama. I called our bank and asked to freeze joint transfers. I sent a short email to the estate's accountant. Effective immediately, please reroute maintenance disbursements to account ending in 9042. I printed a copy and slid it into an envelope. The tone of those notes was businesslike, like a woman closing a ledger. I rented a penthouse downtown for 6 months, somewhere with light, a new tile backsplash, and a balcony where I could see the skyline. It felt audacious and small at once, like buying shoes that fit for the first time in years. I packed the things that mattered: my grandmother's silver, a tea kettle that whistled perfectly, and the framed deed. The boxes were unceremonious: clothes, tools, a stack of restoration journals. I didn't leave with a vindictive slam of the door. I turned the key in the lock once, twice, and left it in the pocket of my coat. A twist came in the quiet between packs. Mark had always talked about legacy as if it were a thing you claim by speaking loudly enough. He had not prepared for consequences. While I was transferring accounts, my attorney, slow, exact, and astute, sent an email that read, "The deed is clean. The signature recorded during the tax scare. Transferred title contingent on liens, which never materialized. You have legal standing to sell." My hands went cold. Selling felt like an extreme move, but the ledger told me another truth. I had poured my inheritance into this place with the belief that the estate was our home, not simply an asset to be rearranged at another's whim. The legal option on the table was not about revenge. It was about writing a ledger by converting a place of constant labor into a secure future for myself. I met with a commercial developer quietly. He was neither rich nor theatrical, just a man who saw value and explained it plainly. "We want to develop a small row of townhomes," he said. "We'll preserve a portion of the facade, keep the stone wall, but it will be economically viable." He nodded when I told him I'd been the one financing the restorations for years. "We can close quickly if the papers are in order." He wasn't offering glory. He was offering an expedient, lawful transaction that would remove the estate as a financial lever in other people's hands. The sale would be clean. That evening, I wrote a single line in my journal. No flourish, no speech. I am done funding other people's choices. Then I signed the sales agreement. I canceled the automatic monthly transfers that had gone into accounts Mark controlled. I called the contractor teams and told them to expect new instructions from the developer. I stopped answering Mark's calls, which was the hardest part for reasons I couldn't fully admit. Old instinct, the habit of being available. He called twice and then called Chloe, who texted, "Please tell her to leave the papers alone. My lawyer replied with a date and a time, closing at 10 a.m. next Friday. Packing my last box, I paused with the deed in my hand. The signature that once had felt like a small administrative act now felt like the hinge in an old door. I slid the deed into the envelope the developer's lawyer had provided and signed my authorization. I didn't shout. I put on a coat and left. The image that stayed with me as I walked out was not a gloating face or an angry fist. It was the unlocked front gate swinging slowly in the autumn wind, the sound of finality. Once I stepped back and let the mechanisms I had set in motion run, consequences cascaded in ways that felt inevitable and quietly brutal. The developer didn't waste time. Within days, permits were expedited, blueprints were filed, a crew arrived to do preliminary surveying. Mark watched it all from the kitchen window with a face that showed the shift from arrogance to panic. People talked differently now. Neighbors who once nodded at morning coffee began to ask pointed questions about banknotes and transfers and signed documents. The gardener waited to be paid and couldn't find the account that used to deposit his weekends. The contractor who'd worked on the roof called me in tears because his supplier had stopped delivering without a clear invoice to the new account. At first, Mark tried to bargain in the old style. He'd show up with promises, deferments, imagined plans. "Viv, you don't have to sell. I'll talk to the developer. We'll work this out," he said one morning, voice high with a hope that sounded almost childish. Chloe called him every night in a different tone, sharp, panicked, then pleading. The realism of their situation landed slowly. Without my payroll, without the automatic transfers, the estate's cash flow froze. Debts that had been papered over with informal promises became real. The preservation board required updated proof of insurance for ongoing work. The insurers began to ask questions about prior transfers and who actually held title. The financial shell, crooked outside of Mark's careful words, began to rattle. Then an unexpected twist arrived that none of us had anticipated. One of Mark's old college friends, an accountant he'd trusted with side investments, sent a notice. A quiet legal letter that said effectively, "Your signature decades ago was used as collateral for a loan that defaulted some years back. We are calling in liens." Mark had always spoken of his friends as if they were part of the family. His network of favors had never been paid in full. The letter meant that creditors began to circle. When their notices arrived, they were aimed at the estate, the thing that Mark had assumed could not be touched. They were also aimed at his reputation. The town committee that handled the historic registry received anonymous tips about how invoices had been redirected. A local paper called, wanting a quote about the sudden collapse of stewardship. In the days that followed, Mark's facade cracked in small human ways. He stopped being clean and composed, mail piled on the kitchen counter. The dog started sleeping more and barked at shadows. Chloe called less often. A contractor refused to continue work until payment cleared, even though she'd been the one picking the curtains. In a meeting with a collections agent, she flung her hands into the air and said, "Mark, why didn't you tell me?" He could only look down and say, "I thought I could handle it," a phrase that finally betrayed years of bad accounting dressed up as bravado. I watched all of this without triumph. When the day arrived that men in hard hats rolled up with plans and machines, I sat on a bench at the edge of the property and sipped tea from a thermos I had brought because part of me still wanted to witness what I had loved. The bulldozers were quieter than I expected, efficient, unornamental machines chewing through hedges and tucking asphalt where gravel had been. Mark stood on the porch and could not make them stop. He shouted to a foreman I couldn't see, "You can't do this, it's our," but the foreman kept his back to him. Creditors had placed a hold. The developer had already paid the permitted fees. The town had approved the change of use. The legal math, something I'd set in motion with a calm hand, had closed faster than any tantrum could repair. An additional twist came when the developer called me personally. He said quietly, "I had no idea the property held so many memories for the community. One of the units I planned is being reserved for a local historical exhibit in honor of your restoration." There was no softening in the message about the townhomes, but there was a nod to preservation in a way that felt like a small act of recognition. I accepted it and didn't gloat. I had not done what I did to be honored. I did it to be free. The implosion continued in the weeks after the first dig. Men who once billed in cash now wanted receipts. Friends who had been on one side of the fence now had to choose a side out of necessity. Chloe began posting fewer pictures. Mark's sister called me, voice shaking, begging for guidance on sorting old family accounts. I told her the truth in a sentence. I sold the estate because I could. The rest is for you to sort. There was nothing theatrical in that refusal, just the small, steady boundary of someone who would no longer underwrite another's choices. They came back, of course. It was almost predictable. A few weeks after the first bulldozers arrived, Mark knocked on my penthouse door at dusk. He looked smaller than he had in years, shoulders curved, hair mussed. Chloe was not with him. He'd stopped grooming himself the way he once did. "Vivian," he said, voice rasping, "please, I didn't mean for this to happen. We can work something out. He didn't finish because I didn't let him. I made them sit on my couch. I poured them tea. It felt important to be exactly as I had been through everything, composed, human, unperfumed by theatrical bitterness. Chloe began to cry quietly, the kind of quiet that is part shame and part shock. Mark offered a list of excuses threaded with blame: the economy, bad advice, poor choices. He looked at me like a man hoping to re-enter a warm room. I listened. Then I took the deed from a drawer and put it on the coffee table between them like a simple object. I did not say, "I told you so." I said, "You were offered the chance to make a life without hurting me. You chose otherwise." They asked for money. They asked for a place to sleep. Chloe begged for time to figure things out. Mark begged for one more chance. I made one last polite, clean motion. I handed back an envelope containing the final statements and a card with the name of a local counselor. "I can't," I said. "I won't be the person who fixes the consequences of choices that were not mine to make." I closed the conversation with the same steady politeness I'd used when transferring accounts. Direct, unemotional, final. They left with less drama than they'd come with. The sound of a car door slamming like a punctuation mark. The mornings after were ordinary in the way that healing often is. I watered the small potted plants I'd put on the penthouse balcony and watched a tiny green shoot I had planted push its first leaves into a corner of sun. I took a class at the community college on landscape design, something I had always loved but never had the energy to do for myself. I made a list of small things. Call my sister, go to the museum, meet the woman who runs the ceramics workshop downtown. The pleasure in these acts was not theatrical. It was simple and durable. One afternoon, I walked past the construction site. The facade they'd promised to preserve stood like a face with a new body behind it. The dust on the road smelled like change. I paused, and rather than mourned what had been, I found my fingers finding the edge of my new teacup tucked into my coat pocket. I sat on a low wall and let the wind take my hair. People who had once been neighbors greeted me as if nothing had happened, their voices warmer now that the scandal had cooled into gossip. A woman I had taught at a garden club handed me a small note, folded in half. It said simply, "You did what you had to. No more, no less, and that was enough." In the evenings, I light candles on my balcony and watch the city breathe. The legal papers, once a source of fear and secrecy, now sit in a bank safety deposit box where they belong. I keep a small photograph on the kitchen counter, a picture of the estate's greenhouse the first winter it was warm. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, not to reopen pain, but to remember that I can create beauty again. I do not gloat when the developer's new units go on the market, or when a line of small families walk the preserved path. There is no need. My victory was never about taking something from someone else. It was about refusing to be invisible any longer. When they ask now, as people sometimes do at gatherings, "How did you go on?" I tell them the truth without theatrics. I took my own worth seriously in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. My days are quieter, but full. I volunteer with a local preservation society, advising on restoration budgets and telling contractors to invoice correctly. I teach a class on small-scale estate care to women who want to hold their ground. The plants on my balcony grow wild in the sun, and I drink my coffee hot while the city wakes. At night, sometimes I dream of the old house and the way light used to break across the dining table. I wake and smile, not from longing, but from the knowledge that I had the courage to protect what mattered to me. I never screamed. I never publicly humiliated anyone. I set a boundary, walked away, and let consequences unfold. That was enough. I have my own life now, shaped not by obligation, but by careful choices, and I sleep well.